I think of like NASA and those things, they scrub a launch because they don't have something ready or another. Like the astronauts aren't calling and saying, we're still going through with it. It's off because the other team members that are reliant on this are saying that, it's not within the correct threshold. And there's a whole number of downstream effects that come up when we start trying to rush these things, and the vendors bringing in trays late, and SPD's trying to make up for lost time and this stuff.
Clock in, scrub up, and join us behind the red line. You're listening to First Case, a perioperative podcast bringing you exciting interviews, engaging discussions, and innovative solutions that are changing the way patients receive surgical care. Each episode, we talk to frontline staff, perioperative leadership, and nursing entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the back table to the boardroom, from wheels in to wheels out, we tackle the real-life issues affecting the OR. Whether you're tuning in for surgical service education or inspiration, we're glad you're here. And now it's time to roll back and start the first case.
This week on First Case, we speak with Jeff Wertz, Chief Commercial Officer at Sergio Health, and we're going to be talking about vendor management, Melanie. And I have been a clinician and a vendor, and Jeff is going to be sharing his experience as a vendor, and his current role at Sergio Health is very much focused on vendor management and utilizing data to help improve those processes. But you've obviously had a great number of dealings with vendors in orthopedics, and you've got some ideas that I think we'll talk about today about how to improve that process.
Yeah, I have a few ideas. Maybe I should keep more of them to myself than maybe I do sometimes, but I had a good relationship with my vendors, and as a general rule. And I really did learn early on that if you give me a good vendor, I can pretty much scrub any case, because the vendors were valuable assets and they really knew what was going on and they could really help. And they saved me more than once when I got thrown into a case that I did not know how to do very well, but they were the experts and they really could help. And there's more, I guess, to vendor management than just that relationship aspect. Obviously, there's data and analysis and ways that we are communicating our policies for having trays and other things that we need to do to make sure we're running efficiently. And so I think it's a good conversation to talk about all the different ways that we can better manage our vendors so that we can provide good care.
All right, we're going to be right back with Jeff Wertz, Chief Commercial Officer at Sergio Health.
I'm Melanie Perry.
And I'm Justin Poulin.
A 17 Studios production, you're listening to First Case.
Joining us now is Jeff Wertz, Chief Commercial Officer at Sergio Health, and we're going to be talking about vendor management. And sometimes this conversation can get, a little dicey. But Jeff, I'm really excited because I know you've been a vendor and you know that side of the equation. I think you're going to bring a lot to the table in this conversation and how to kind of connect everybody and pull this information together and smooth out the process. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. You're setting me up for quite a bit there. I hope I can live up to it.
We know you will. You've done a lot with us on our sister podcast, Beyond Clean. And so we love having you on. You're actually one of our subject matter experts on the expert series for Beyond Clean. So a little plug there. Obviously, this vendor management conversation touches on a lot of different departments. We're here to talk about the operating room today, but it also touches sterile processing. And when we start to dive into the conversation, we're going to hear a connection to supply chain today as well. So as we kind of kick this off, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself, Jeff, but I'm also going to add another little piece and have you tell us what you love to do in your free time. So I'm going to add that in there if you can tell us more about yourself.
Man, you're throwing in wild card questions I didn't see coming. All right. So first off, my background, right? So I started off in medical devices working with an independent distributor, kind of starting at the bottom of the totem pole, running trays all over the place. Got in with Stryker Orthopedics, specializing in trauma. was around the Chicago area, transferred down to Phoenix. And I did that for another year and a half in the Phoenix area. And then I really just got tired of, not really tired, but seeing all the inefficiencies and opportunity on working on the digital side of things to try to improve workflows, process, information coming out of it for everyone involved. So I started working on the technology side of healthcare at this point about seven and a half years ago. So really excited with where the space goes. Yes, so that's my background. And then what I like to do in the free time, I've got 2 French bulldogs, spending time with them, and then being active in Arizona. So I'm from the Midwest originally and love being in Arizona. So it's, pickleball, golf, in the mountains, running, working out, anything outside. So just soaking that up.
The French bulldogs are new though, right?
Oh no, I've had, we added a second one to the brood last year. So yeah, we've got an 8.5-year-old and a 1-year-old.
Nice. All right. Well, let's dive into the vendor management conversation. And we're going to take this from 2 sides of, really a multifaceted equation, but the 2 that are relevant to the conversation today, what's been the issue from the vendor's perspective? And I'll even let Melanie chime in, from the OR and even SPD perspective, and you can add color to that too. But from the vendor's perspective, where's the struggle here in terms of vendor management?
Yeah, I think in talking with a lot of my friends and former colleagues that are still in it, a lot of it anymore is just there's a lot of friction that takes place in trying to service your clients. So from a rep's perspective, their client is the surgeon, and that's who they're tight with. That's who they're, most focused on providing the service for, because they're the ones choosing you as a company and you as a rep to be involved with that surgery and support them. And I think a lot of the friction comes from everything leading up to it. So every single hospital has a different policy, and then how much the OR knows about that policy versus SPD and how much those 2 are communicating. So just the process on a daily basis of, all right, when am I able to deliver? What are the different steps that I have to go through, whatever hoops that you have to jump through in getting there. So am I going to have to, log into the vendor credentialing system that's on one side of the hospital, then you got to go over to another side of the hospital and get your scrubs. There's just all these different kind of challenges or barriers that are kind of put up in that process. Those are little things, but also more so in like the communication piece can be a big challenge of who's needed for what and when cases cancel versus not. There's a lot of time and money spent in the logistics aspect of it. And that's, I think, creates a lot of the challenges between what the vendors are trying to do. And if they end up cutting corners in the hopes that it improves their chances of being able to get assets in on time and available for cases. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges anymore today is a lot of the inbound process, communication, and documentation of a lot of those things.
Well, I feel like scheduling is queen, right? It's the ruler of how this all works. And if you have bad scheduling, it can really be a nightmare. Melanie, from your perspective, I'm going to kind of throw this over to you, even though you're also a host. When it comes to, and you worked in orthopedics, so the 2 of you are a perfect match for this conversation, at least from an orthopedics perspective. But what was the real struggle? I feel like sometimes you felt the same pains that the vendors did because you're just trying to get the surgery to happen and be done timely and on time, et cetera. But what are some of the struggles from the OR's perspective?
Well, we don't have a whole hour to discuss that because it is very multifaceted. Let me pull out my list. But it's the issue, I guess, there's a lot of them. One of them was always the frustration of last minute cases or not being communicated with from the surgeon's office. And the surgeon would just expect us to know maybe who we needed, or they wouldn't put it in their posting comments. And so we didn't know who to reach out to. Or the surgeon's office would say, oh, we've already let the vendor know. So we're like, well, we don't know who's coming, so we hope they are. And then the case is on the next day and there's nobody there and nobody got told and the ball got dropped. And so communication was always frustrating and difficult. And then on the other side of it, at least in my experience, I'm going to buffer this with just what my experience has been. I've seen OR directors, OR managers who really treat vendors like second-class citizens in the OR. And so they're not treated like people sometimes. And it's not really fair to treat our vendors that way when we need them for our cases. Like, especially orthopedics. I mean, most of our cases we can't do if there's not a vendor there to help, with implants or supplies or equipment, whatever. And yet they don't get treated well. And so then there's fighting to try to get into the OR, get what they need, and they don't make it easy. I've also had a few vendors who have created the problem and made it worse for themselves because their behavior was questionable and they did not act above board. And so it's just been I have a long list, but it's a big issue, and there's a lot of different sides to the story and facets to the diamond, I guess, that just make it a topic of conversation that hopefully we can improve because, especially in orthopedics or spine or any of those other we can't do our cases without vendors. So we really need to make the environment where we can actually work together. I'll get off my soapbox now. Sorry.
Jeff, what would you kind of say? Like, was that your experience as well? That, sometimes you just would find that it's a contentious situation, which makes it hard to be collaborative.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's funny. It's almost like she's echoing a lot of the same challenges, but from the OR's perspective of, what does the surgeon want to use? A lot of this goes back to the surgeon and how they want to interact in their own personalities and expectations at the facility. So like you have some of these surgeons that don't want to make a decision based on indication. Totally understand that's relevant, but there has to be a certain point in time where it's unrealistic to accommodate for that. But the expectation at some facilities can be whatever you say goes, even if it's 12 hours before the case, he wants to have 2 or 3 different vendor options in the room. And that equates to 36 trays and just 1/4 of them are going to get actually used. And none of this information could have been identified prior to the procedure. That I'm sure happens legitimately from time to time. But I think anymore today, there's enough information and pre-planning that could be accomplished and just kind of driving them to make that decision ahead of time. So I think you can't paint any of these things with a broad brush. And I think a lot of it just starts with getting some of that information codified and everyone on the same team, because I think what ends up happening is a lot of time I can relate with the OR really easily because we're both trying to work towards the same goal of keeping the surgeon happy and the patient safe and getting through a safe, efficient surgery with them. But then you run into the other challenges of I'm trying to get all this done. The OR's on the same page with me, but now I run down into the SPD and I'm bringing stuff in late and now I'm impacting their day and I'm still the bad guy with them. There's a lot of different challenges that come from just that kind of scheduling piece. And even that isn't easy because I understand from the surgeon's perspective of when you have office staff that you're having high turnover and trying to implement a new medical record system within your office and how challenging all these different technological capabilities can be. Setting up a system for that can be really, really challenging. But I think that starting with the hospital and working with the OR team and setting clear expectations between SPD and the OR so that everyone is on the same page, you start moving in that direction. It's one of those, kind of discipline equals freedom type things that the facilities that have a set policy that everyone agrees to, that the OR is going to stick with, that the SPD also knows, then you kind of team up not against the surgeon, but the surgeon knows that this is the policy, and if it doesn't follow through, he's not going to be able to override. I think of like NASA and those things. They scrub a launch because they don't have something ready or another. Like the astronauts aren't calling and saying we're still going through with it. It's off because the other team members that are reliant on this are saying that it's not within the correct threshold, and there's a whole number of downstream effects that come up when we start trying to rush these things, and the vendors bringing in trays late, and SPD's trying to make up for lost time, and they miss stuff.
I mean, if we remove emergent add-ons from the picture, because obviously those are going to be a completely different discussion, a completely different way of handling, because you just can't predict what a trauma or what an emergency fracture or something that you have to put on is going to do. But in regularly scheduled cases, when we know what we're doing, we know what's posted. I think you're very right in saying having clear policies that, trays need to be brought in. They need to be brought in at a certain time. And when people are consistently following those practices and they're reasonable, for the vendors as well, because some things just aren't reasonable. I've had vendors who've said this case might be scheduled and it might have been on for a week, but this particular case, there's only one tray in the entire state. I can't get that tray to you until XYZ time. But if we have that clear communication between the OR and SPD and our vendors, and we're respectfully treating each other like that, then suddenly it's okay when you have the one tray that needs to come from, 6 hours away to get there, versus consistently providing trays on time so that SPD doesn't hate you every time you show up at 5 a.m. for the 7 a.m. start.
Well, and to kind of expand on that, that's going to become, I think, even more of a bigger issue moving forward here. So supply chain for all these companies is becoming more and more strained, where just getting product, making sure it's available, because they are importing it from another country and they can't get access to a lot. So they have to do a lot more with a lot less. And while at the same time, all these surgeries going to surgery centers throughout different areas. So you're kind of decentralized where that equipment is stored and managed. And the secret, there's kind of isn't a secret, but I don't think the manufacturers do a great job of optimizing any of their inventory either. They have a really tough time in identifying where to allocate their inventory, and it costs them quite a bit of money to logistically manage and move all that inventory around. When you're talking, because like when I was a rep at Stryker, it was first overnight everything, because I didn't know any better. They didn't discuss anything, and I want to have it and make it available. And that's why they had a gigantic FedEx bill at the end of the year. But there's a ton of opportunity for improving that information that's shared, and working with the hospitals proactively to have some of those conversations. And that's where I think everything needs to move towards is better partnerships around that stuff, where it benefits everyone. Because right now, a lot of it gets lost with me being the local rep managing logistics. And I'm not a logistics person, and I'm going to cover my end first.
Everything that you're saying makes sense. Who do we need to get involved then within the system to really make sure that we improve the relationships that we have with our vendors?
Yeah, I think it's including supply chain in some of these discussions, or whoever's managing those contracts. I think it's kind of crazy. This is probably not going to go over great with all of my vendor colleagues in there, but the only people that aren't measured on value in that healthcare model is around like the vendors and spend. The GPOs look at the manufacturers and they look at, well, what do we spend? And I think inherently that's kind of off. And just looking at a credentialing system, whether I scan in or scanned out at 2 a.m, it doesn't really tell the story of how I'm partnering with the hospital. But if you can put some more teeth or requirements in those contracts moving forward of, as a hospital, we'll give you this X information so that you can, just for example, if we can give access to, hey, every time Dr. Jones schedules a case, we are going to communicate that with you guys proactively, set up a notification process for that so that the manufacturer can actually proactively forecast their demand needs, but then also holding them accountable for those services. But I know that the manufacturers struggle with demand forecasting and what the reps are requiring at these sites. So I think creating more of a creative contracting models that hold them to the standard of what's expected of on-time deliveries, looking at opportunities around reducing variation. Those are some of the things that I'm working on with our team also, of looking at, how many trays per case and creating that opportunity to have the conversation with the surgeons. So it's not saying you can't use that many, but let's look at why are we using that many more trays? Is this something that the manufacturers are doing for how they're setting up their trays? Or is this just something that you want because 2 years ago something went wrong and you want to have backups on backups? But it's one of those things that many facilities just aren't measuring or looking at. And, it's a feeling more so. And they go off of, yeah, we have great vendors because, in general, I like them. They do well and they mean well. But there's not a whole lot of data and information to support it. And I think that can go a long way for contracting, improving that process and expectation, and driving a lot more efficiency. I just think in general, like orthopedics and spine especially, it's some of the biggest profit generators at these hospitals. And there's so much unknown that is on my shoulders. And I'm, reliable. I like to think that I'm going to try my hardest, but was there a more efficient way for me to get some of that inventory, make it available? Chances are, yeah, if I was able to use my resources at the manufacturer more efficiently.
So then what data do you think we should be collecting, or what should we be measuring in order to be more efficient?
Anything. Literally.
That's a great answer.
Anything. I try to do some of these HSPA meetings and conferences. I think it's still astounding the level of division still between OR and SPD. Where you're at a facility where SPD would like to have a more stringent vendor program, but they can't get support from the OR, which is mind-boggling to me. But I also kind of understand, OR has a lot going on and they don't want to upset the apple cart, which is the surgeon. And if you don't have a strong, leadership in the OR, it can be difficult for SPD to have a large enough voice to say, hey, we're making this policy because it's impacting us. So what I like to talk about is what's going to be most valuable for you guys to get a policy going. And you have to look at who you're trying to sell it to. So if you're an SPD and you have tons of issues with vendors bringing trays in late and you can't get the OR to implement a stringent vendor policy, you need to just start collecting how often trays are coming in late so you can give them something tangible to them and say, this is how many are coming in late over the last 2 weeks. And then ask them how many cases started on time because trays aren't unavailable, or how does this impact them? Because you have to be looking at the audience for that and how it's directly impacting them. Otherwise, they're going to have a tough time, when you're arguing about not having IFUs for sets, that the OR doesn't know the connection of how impactful that is to your day-to-day. But if you say, hey, these trays coming in late ultimately impact your ability to start on time, and they delivered this many late for us, this is why it's happening, then they start making some of those connections. So any information is better than no information, and no one takes it seriously. Yet I saw a quote recently, and that I think is spot on. If you're not measuring it, it doesn't matter. And that's what I think one of the biggest challenges has been overall with SPD, with many things.
Yeah, I think talking back about your quality metrics, like on time starts, first case starts, and even to follow cases, getting them back in the room on time. Those are metrics that the OR understands. It's speaking our language. And when it comes to, it's not always that the patient wasn't ready in pre-op, or that, the surgeon was stuck in traffic, or they were late, or had an emergency case. It really could just be that our trays didn't show up until 5 a.m. And so suddenly we can't roll back. I've actually had that happen multiple times, and I've had to go to a surgeon and be like, sorry, we can't roll back. Your trays aren't ready. I told him one time, you need to go talk to your favorite vendor and tell him he needs to get his trays here earlier because we can't get them ready when they come in this late. And then suddenly that initiates the conversation that, oh, hey, let's look at all the factors. And that really puts, I think, SPD communicating with OR in a way that we understand, says, hey, this is why this is affecting us. It helps the OR and SPD make a connection that makes sense to both of us, so we can hopefully improve it and make the OR more efficient.
And that's where I think there's huge opportunity for more discussion between the two, of discussing, hey, what could impact this? What can we do to help you with it? Because that you need to have some common ground where you guys are on the same team, because that's what I talk about also. The surgeon and I are typically going to be on the same team, where I know they've got my back. And when I'm in the OR and I hear the OR talking about how they don't understand the SPD policy or something along those lines, I know that I can do whatever the heck I want down there, because you're going to end up taking the surgeon's back, which if so facto is my back. So I bring these things in late, not going to have an issue. But when you guys are working together towards something and saying, hey, we're going to try to, just measure how many errors that came up from SPD, that's where a lot of times the SPD is just unaware of it. Same as the vendor. I didn't know if I brought trays in dirty or had bioburden in those things. And I never would but it wasn't on purpose, but it's just a lot of this information sharing and working together to make things better overall. And it can be cumbersome, early on, but there's tools out there. There's technologies out there that make these things much more attainable. And I think it's just a disservice to the patient at a certain level, where we're not implementing some of these things and pulling that information in and improving the data and evaluating it, because healthcare is so far behind on a lot of this. You have a space age setup in the OR where you have a Da Vinci, you have robots in there helping out with it and doing all this incredible stuff. And it's running on a department that has to, claw tooth and nail to get any technology put in for them to support that department. And I think there's so much opportunity for improving it. And then that improves the long-term, long-tail effect of using that information to continuously work better, more efficiently, saves money over the long term for sure.
I think a lot of those technologies really focus on the communication piece too. And I'm thinking about how proactive can we be without data? Well, we really can't. Everybody loves a hero, but even your best vendor can only be a hero so many times before they're bringing the tray in at 5 a.m. And that was a heroic effort. And yet it still doesn't get us the desired result. And, there could be a whole multitude of factors and breakdowns in communication leading up, to that happening. And we just had an interview about block scheduling, and we talked about how sometimes, it's really just the communication around scheduling through multiple people that have a stake in that schedule, and those wires get crossed all the time. And that's where I think, it's great to have the data that will tell us like how many times did the tray come in late, and we can measure that and everything else. But then also, what about just communicating when it is behind, like in advance, instead of when the tray gets there at 5 a.m., that's when we say no, because that really doesn't allow us to prepare in the operating room for any shift or changes. You're not going to do an add-on when you're, for the first case of the day, when the tray shows up at 5, there's no way to deploy, any kind of action in there. And so I think that's where the policies piece comes into place too. But there's policy, and then there's the actual ability to measure and manage it. So what are some other ways that technology can kind of remove some of the heroics and just allow for more smooth operations?
From a technology standpoint, I think it's really important to kind of set expectations on what's realistic at your location. So going from 0 to 10 is a big leap, and it takes starting somewhere to be collecting it and improving it over time. Like your iPhone didn't start out this good. If you just look back 2 years ago, even 2 years ago, you can't do a whole lot of what you built it up to. So you have to start from one point. And I think that there's a ton of opportunity that over time will continue to improve upon of how you can set up some of those automations of scheduling, who's required for what procedures. But I think where some facilities fall apart in that process is they try to do too much at once and take on too much, and most facilities don't have that standardized to that level. I mean, you look at surgeon preferences, for example, at many facilities, it's going to say, just call the striker, call Jeff. And that's where you don't have that intel. And it might be call Jeff, but I know for this indication, I need to call another rep. And when you start setting up some of these things that are supposed to be automated, you find out, and when the rubber meets the road, it's not that black and white a lot of times. So it's not, you can only bring in these sets when you are asked for a case, because there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes of the surgeon knows that there's another implant in there. And he asked me, the rep, to help take care of finding out who can get that other set to remove that implant that's in there. And I think that that's where you have to kind of bridge the gap of expectations and reality and take the time to help move it there. And that's where my approach is really looking at taking what currently is working and putting that into a digital format so you can continue to improve upon that. And that's where we try to provide that roadmap of here's where you're at, here's the data and information of how you can start trying to move towards this automation without being a huge change on your day to day.
Okay, so I want to steer a little bit away from the data and technical part of vendor management to more the vendor relationship part of it, and how the way we treat our vendors really affects our ultimate working relationship with vendors. And I guess to maybe set the stage a little bit, in my experience with vendors, I mentioned it a little earlier, I've had directors and managers who really always treated our vendors like they were just almost like second-class citizens in the hospital. It was strange to me that they didn't get treated. I mean, they're not our employees, but they're still needed for the case, and they just didn't treat them well. Or the vendors come into hospitals, and like you said, it's not where they have to go sign in and check in is way on the other side of the hospital, and then they've got to be somewhere completely different to make it to a case. Or they have to pay for scrubs when they come to the hospital, and they're why do vendors have to pay for scrubs? Or the one place I worked, they made our vendors look like they were prisoners. I mean, they had these awful, awful brown scrubs with the word vendor stamped all over them. They looked like they needed to be on cleanup crew on the highway. I don't know. It did not say, we have a good working relationship. We know that you're a valuable part of the patient's surgical care, and that, we need, we respect you. Or it just didn't send a good message. Yeah. What'd you say?
Yeah. Value you.
Yeah, we don't value you. That's a good way to put it. And then so I feel like if somebody doesn't feel valued, why in the world do they care what our policies are? So why do we have policies that we expect to be enforced if we're not going to treat these vendors that like they're people? And from an ortho gal, I loved my ortho reps. Loved them. 98% of them. I had a couple that really gave me a headache. But as a general rule, they were great guys and gals. I loved them. And it just didn't make sense to me that we, as an organization, didn't maybe take into consideration the value that they were providing the hospital. And then maybe how we treated them might actually determine how well they cared what our policies were and worked hard to help us with what we were trying to do with our quality metrics. Does that make sense at all in what I'm saying?
Yeah, I fully agree with everything you're saying. Like, first and foremost, I think where it comes from is it's always been one of those industries that's like, I remember trying to get into it. Like, you kind of have to know someone to kind of break into it. And it's this like kind of on a pedestal to be able to get into it. And then once you've broken into it, there's kind of a stigma about you of, like, I fit the stereotypical striker rep role. I fully understand. And like,
yeah.
I was an athlete in college, but like, that's the type of people that they're looking for, is driven individuals that want to work on a team and are successful. And that's kind of what it is. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that they're a bad person. So I think that, and then the other point of it is, like, you can make very good money in it. Like, you can make very good money in doing a lot of different things. It doesn't give you a right to just not like them as a person. So I think it's a big challenge in general. Like, I think a lot of the vendor policies at a lot of the facilities get put in place by people that don't quite know all the ins and outs of it. And I think a lot of lazy strategies, for lack of a better term, are just centered at, let's make the vendors deal with it.
Right.
Because
I've heard that. Mm-hmm.
They make a bunch of money, and, they can deal with the margin, and we'll just pass it back on to them. And if it's going to drive value back, I always look at it from a software perspective. If you want people to utilize the software, you have to make it so that there's some value in them, or for them as well. You look at a lot of the tools that are available anymore, you can get value out of them for free. And where you pay for it is that additional data and information and the value that you get from it. So that's kind of always been my approach with it. And I think that needs to be more so of, if we're going to charge for this, like, what value do they really get from it? Is, and I think within the hospital, of like what they make you wear and everything, there's supposedly different reasons for that, so that people can identify who you are. I've never quite understood it, because it's not like a everywhere thing. And I think most of the people that I worked with are kind of indifferent to it. Like, it is what it is. But where it really becomes frustrating is when you're just trying to help out, and it seems like they've put things in your way as, like, just out of spite. And it's like, okay, well, I didn't have time to walk across the campus to do this or that. And, I didn't have time to go check out because it was 2 a.m. And those are the things that I experienced as a trauma rep, where I'm like, this is just a bit absurd for you guys to make that a requirement. And then half the time the computer doesn't work, or this or that isn't working. And I think it just requires some more of that understanding of, this is a partnership. Here's the value I'm trying to deliver. If you think I'm not delivering it, let me know, but I'll follow any of the policies. But it is realistic, like allowing them in the break room and things like that. I understand maybe not the surgeon break room, the surgeon lounge, they try to sell and stuff like that. But when you're not allowed in the staff break room, it's like, okay, come on. And then you're upset when I'm not in the OR. But then it get really frustrating when you're trying to find out about a time of a case and it's 5:00 at night and you're trying to spend some time with your family too. And they're like, yep, it's going to be on time. And then you show up and they're like, oh, that's not going to go for like 3 hours. And you drove a half hour to be there. And it's like, just some common mutual respect would be really great. But that's where being able to build those relationships. I don't know if there's a quick solution to that part of it, because it's been a long time building that together.
Just like any other relationships, things take time to improve and time to heal. But I think recognizing that they're providing value would help, I think, in improving everything. So
yeah, I think it's like the pendulum has swung completely the other way, because I've heard stories from like early on when I was starting of some of the older reps that like never had to go into the OR and they just get a phone call, and it was like, yeah, they just hang out and didn't have to do as much, and now it's like you have to go over and above. And I'm honestly hearing more now than I ever have of colleagues and former just medical device reps that are leaving the industry because it's become so saturated with all of these different, reps that are around and these new policies. And it's just the day to day of it's, expensive at this point. It cuts very much into their margins, driving all around, all the different credentialing services they have to pay for. And then, every single thing that you can get nickel and dimed for along the way. And then the price of the implants continuing to go down. There has to be some more efficiencies put into that process.
All right. So Jeff, time has gotten away from us. It's always a good conversation when we talk to you. But before we go, can you maybe highlight just the benefits that we can experience when we have strong vendor relationships?
Oh, I mean, I think there's definitely a role there continuously moving forward. The level of complexity with all the different instrumentation that's in there for every procedure. When I talk about it with my friends and family that are asking, like, you're in the OR for a case, it's like, yeah, there is a function that I can definitely serve in there of helping the hospital work more efficiently. And so it's making sure that the right things are prepped and put in place proactively, considering the surgeon's needs. Like, those are the things that are kind of intangibles that I always try to do at any place of I'll add value wherever I can. And it's almost like a technical rep can be able to provide that stuff. And with all of the different travelers that can go to different hospitals and, the quality of the data around surgeon preferences, just being in the room to be like, oh, he likes the table this way or that way. And, he's going to want to use this instrument or that instrument, or she prefers this setup for each one of those. There's a lot of those intangibles that can go a long ways, and also just proactively making sure that things are available. So like, if I know that preemptively that this patient had a previous surgery, a lot of the strategic training that we did as reps were like how to plan for some of these contingencies. That's where I liked the trauma side of it of, it's not always cut and dry, and you have a backup plan for some of these things. And when you get to be the one that actually was like, oh yeah, I actually prepped for that, brought in, we have some of these other trays here, or I know that you have other trays on the shelf here. Here's how we can do it. There's a lot of value in that. And, with how much turnover and staffing are at a lot of these facilities now, like, that's an invaluable piece. There's certainly OR teams and scrub techs and everyone else that's involved that can provide those things, but it's just a reliable piece or a great thing for a rep to be able to provide some of that.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I think that specialization and experience part is tough, right? Because everybody in the operating room, even though you might be, experienced in a service line, you're not necessarily experienced in every single procedure, especially the ones that are less common. And that's when I think it's extremely valuable to have a well-prepared and well-trained rep that's in the room.
Yeah. And like, I see way more of this procedure done at different hospitals, all these different settings. And you can get, like, once you've been doing it for long enough, there's a value to getting that second opinion of, hey, I saw Dr. So-and-so doing it this way at this other place, maybe try that technique. That's really where you can, really make your bones as a as a reliable resource. And I knew a lot of fantastic reps that were completely, they read all the literature, they were up to speed on all of it. But that's where they were able to provide those services, and that's where really unique.
All right, Jeff, great job as always, and appreciate you coming on the First Case podcast.
Thanks for having me. It was great. I love it. It's great conversations to be having. Need more of them.
That was Jeff Wertz, Chief Commercial Officer at Sergio Health, and we're talking about vendor management and really the benefits of having a collaborative relationship between the clinicians and the suppliers and vendors and working together really towards that common goal. In many cases, though, Melanie, as you and Jeff outlined, really, the frontline staff and the vendors are very much on the same page. It just maybe sometimes gets a little contentious when you're talking about leadership. And, we've had a lot of conversations about culture on this show, and you definitely described, some cultures that were not really geared towards fostering those positive relationships.
Yeah, I mean, it's just what I've experienced in my time in the OR, and I'm a very relationship-oriented person. That's just who I am. And so I can't stand when I see people, especially when I'm working, I see people who are helping and they're providing a service and we need it, and then other people are making it frustrating or difficult for them to be in the space. And so I really think there's areas that we can improve our working relationships and improve the way that we work together so that we can really ultimately improve the care that we give.
All right. Well, that's going to do it for this week's show. As a reminder, you can help support First Case by subscribing on Apple, Amazon, Google Podcasts. You can also find us on Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or simply search for First Case on your favorite podcast application. We've also got bonus content for some of these episodes, but you've got to download our smartphone app for iPhone and Android. And while you're there, we'd certainly appreciate a rating and a review because your feedback is important to the show. And speaking of feedback, if you have any recommendations for topics or guests on a future episode, just send an email to info@firstcasemedia.com. On behalf of Melanie and myself, thank you for listening to this week's episode of First Case.